So I'm going to introduce myself. So my name is Gernot. I'm from Austria, and I work in Austria for an institute called Zacharias Institute, which is an NGO and which basically explores the whole question between faith, science, philosophy, different religions. I'm a Christian, so we are in dialogue with other religions. And the job title that I have is OCCA Fellow. So I'm a fellow of the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. Who of you knows what this is? Yes, exactly. Oh, one person. So nobody knows what it is, and I always have to introduce my job to people, and so that's what I had to do last week when I visited my grandmother. I told my grandmother that's my job. I'm an OCCA Fellow. I work for the Oxford Center for Christian Apologetics. And she's like, what are you doing all day? What's that kind of a job? And I told her, well, I try to answer difficult questions for people. I travel to different places in Austria, in Germany, or today in Armenia. And I try to give answers to difficult questions. For example, where is God if I need him? And so my grandmother said, well, that sounds very, very interesting. And then she thought about the question and she said, but why are they inviting you? Why are they paying you to come? Because there is no answer to that question. So I hope I can give an answer today. I hope there is more to this than my grandmother was saying. But I think my grandmother is right in some way, because that's a question that people have been thinking about basically since there are humans, and they have been thinking about it all around the globe. So you have, for example, religions that are just founded because of that question. So Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, he just founded Buddhism just because he wanted to find out, why is there so much evil in the world? Why is there so much pain? Why is there so much suffering in the world? Or we look to philosophers, so we look to the great philosopher of Greece or the great philosophers of different philosophical systems. And that was one of the main questions all around the world. If you go to Africa, if you go to Asia, that's one of the questions people are asking. And I think the reason why people are asking this question, that thing is not as stable as I imagined it to be. Anyways, the reason why people are asking this question is, it's fine. I just do it impromptu. So the reason why people ask this question is because it's a very interesting question on two levels. So on the first level, it's a very interesting question because it's an intellectually challenging question. So I don't know who of you loves philosophy, or most of you are medicine students, so I don't know how much you like the philosophical topics, but there is this typical thing where it's like, if there is a God who is good and who loves human beings, and this God is all powerful, and there is evil in the world, what is the answer to that? It's very nice. What is the solution to this difficult problem? How can we make sense of a good God who loves us, who is interested in us, who is all powerful, but at the same time there is evil in the world? And then there's different philosophical systems to try to answer that. So some say, well, maybe there is a God, but maybe he's not really good, and maybe he's not really loving, and maybe he's not, or maybe he's very distant. And that's one of the answers people give. Or another answer people give is, oh, maybe there is a God, but the reality is he really would love to help us, and he really doesn't like evil in the world, and he really doesn't like if we're suffering, but he just is not powerful enough to change anything about it. There's some strange reason which hinders him to do anything about it. Or there's a famous German philosopher, Nietzsche. He said, well, the only excuse God has because of all the suffering is actually because it doesn't exist. That's the easiest answer. Or then if you go to the pantheistic systems, Buddhism or Hinduism, the answer usually is, well, because suffering is an illusion. It's not something real. It's something where either the Buddha would say suffering is something where we have to realize it's not real, we are part of all of it, we are suffering because we think it's real. Or Hinduism would more or less, or some forms of Hinduism would say, well, it is this struggle to better our souls, to pay for some karmic system. So there are those different options. And I think that those are very interesting options, but my guess is that most people of you are not staying up late night and thinking, oh, how could I solve those philosophical problems? Most of us think about that question because it's a deeply personal question. So if I ask you, where is God if I really need Him? Most of you have very specific stories in your head. Most of you have very specific memories of times when you were thinking, oh wow, I would really need such a God if such a God would exist. Where is He now? I would really need His help. And I think the reason why we think about that is because we are actually we're living in a world full of contradictions, let's say it like that. So on one hand, the world is very, very beautiful. I mean, I would suppose all of you know that feeling if you just really enjoy the day. You go out, you sit out with your friends and you're having a dinner, or it's a very hot day, the sun is shining, you have something cool to drink, you have fun, you laugh, and you're like, oh wow, I would love every day is like that. Or you just, I don't know who of you is in love, but if you're just freshly in love, you fall in love, and the other person responds to that love, and you start to make plans, and it's like, oh wow, I wish I would be happily ever after, like in the fairy tales, and you make those plans. And that's when you really think, oh, wow, I hope that stays on forever. Or there's this moment where you reach a particular goal. So from what I've gathered from some of the conversations is most of you are here for 6 years to make your medical degree. So there's 6 years you're in a different country, in a foreign country, you study hard. Apparently, according to the finger game, some of you stay up all night to study for an exam. So you have this really, really far goal that you try to reach. And then you achieved your goal and you're like, yes, I made it. That's the moment I was waiting for, I was working for. I invested so much. And at that moment it feels like, whoa, I would love that this beautiful sunny day, or this fresh love, or my greatest achievement, that this feeling would stay on forever. But the truth is, let's make it more personal, actually, I know that feeling quite well. I was happy in my life as well, maybe I don't. And one of the significant moments for me when I was very, very happy was last year in June. I suppose most of you are students and you're very responsible people, so you don't have kids right now. But last year I had my third child while I was studying. And that's a beautiful moment. I was holding my little daughter in my arms, and I'm very confused today. My little son in my arms, and I don't know why I'm so confused right now. Anyways, I blame it on the falling things. So I was holding my little son in my arms, and it's this feeling of yes, that's my boy, and he's so precious, he's so beautiful. If you would see me, it's those beautiful brown eyes, and he looks like a little very cute guinea pig, and he's just awesome, and you feel like, yes, that's the moment that I've been living for. That's such a beautiful feeling. But obviously the weather changes, times change, and so I don't want to spoil your love that you have right now, but the weather changes, and everybody has at some point in their falling in love period that ends at some point, and then you start to have the first fight, and you start to come into a new period, a new season of your love life. Or if you have this beautiful summer day, it doesn't stay summer all year, there's rain sometime, and you can't stay with your friends forever. Or when you reach that goal and you have your degree and you're finished, there's a point where you start your job and your job feels heavy and it doesn't feel as fulfilling. So we all know there's those moments where we then ask, okay, God, I was so happy just recently. Why am I not as happy right now? Why am I feeling so left alone? Where are you right now? And the reason I was telling you the story of my son is because I experienced that in the hospital with my son. So my son, he's a wonderful boy, but unfortunately he was diagnosed with a kidney condition in the womb of my wife. So they had to deliver him early, and when they delivered him early, we had this beautiful moment with our son, but then they took him away from us and they had all kinds of medical checkups with him. They found his bladder doesn't work, and we were waiting anxiously and said, okay, what is the reason? And the doctors were looking and looking, and we were praying for healing. Me and my wife, we are both Christians, so we were praying, God, please heal our son, please do something. And I'm sure all of you know that feeling where you're like, okay, if there's a God, he will answer it, but there is no answer at that moment. We feel very much left alone. We feel like, okay, why is this happening? Why is this so purposeless sometimes? Why does it feel so lonely? Why does it feel so difficult sometimes? Why is life sometimes so hard? And obviously those two have to be connected. So I'm telling you all those stories and all those ideas while being confused, because I think we have to keep those two things together. So on the one hand, I said at the beginning, there are many ideas in philosophical systems. So if you want a philosophical answer, there is a philosophical answer to that problem. There are many philosophical answers to that problem. And then of course on the other side, you have to deal with the fact that it is not only a philosophical problem, but all of us will feel that moment. So if when I was sitting in the hospital and I was on my knees praying for my son and we were sad, it would not have helped me if somebody would say, well, you know, the answer to your problem is philosophically quite easy. If you take this and take that and take that, you see, it's no problem at all. There's two things that have to come together. And if you really want to give a good answer, we have to put both answers together. Because some people, they really like the intellectual part, but then hope and joy dry up if we only have the intellectual part. On the other hand, some people really like the emotional answers. But if they not match up intellectually, we are actually double sorry at the end, because our hope is crushed and our situation has not changed. It's like if you have a broken arm and instead of going to the doctor and putting a cast on it, you take just painkillers. Of course you won't feel the pain, but at some point your arm is still broken, you still need help. And to make it quick or to make it short, I would like to invite you to listen to my take on the story, because however we answer the question, we have to be consistent with answering the question. We cannot say, well, you know, it's the global supermarket of religions, and I take a little bit of that, and I take a little bit of this. So those two things have to come together. If we want to have a consistent answer, a consistent life, we have to think of what does a philosophical answer do to us emotionally. And I personally believe, and that's then up to you in the Q&A, so at the end of the event there's the opportunity to ask questions, to challenge what I'm saying. But I would like to invite you in to the biblical answer to that question for a very simple reason. Because I think the Bible gives probably the most profound answer to that question. So what the Bible does is it invites us into an answer. That's just a little spoiler, that's a claim. So my job is now to prove that. And then obviously I want you to challenge it if you don't agree with me. So the first thing about faith, so whatever faith you have, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Hindu, if you're a Buddhist, if you're a Christian, is always, well, those people of faith, they don't think about it. There's a very famous saying in my home country, I will say it in German, I will try to translate it. It's Hände falten, Goschen halten, which means basically, translated, it was a saying by a politician. He said, you know, if you have problems, if you're not feeling well, just fold your hands and pray and shut up and don't bother talking about it. Just pretend everything is fine and hope that God will make everything alright. And I think that's a very bad answer. That's not a Christian answer. So I know thought systems and religious systems that say, well, just pretend you're happy. Especially if we are in a culture. I've been to Thailand, I've been to Romania, where there's a very strong sense of you are not supposed to talk about your problems. Keep your problems for yourself. But if you look at the Bible does actually something very differently. So let me read you from one of the prophets in the Bible called Habakkuk. He says, how long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere. I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. I think that sounds, at least to me, it sounds familiar. I know that feeling of seeing violence, of seeing those things, of seeing evil things that happen. And this guy is a prophet of God, so he's like the Champions League or whatever you want to call it of believers. Basically, he gets direct words from God, and he directly speaks from God. But this guy challenges God and says, "How long, God? I cry out to you. You do not answer. Where is help coming from?" And God he gives to Habakkuk an answer. We'll come back to the answer we find in the Bible consistently. But the one thing we do not find with Habakkuk is that God ever criticizes him for actually bringing his heartfelt cry to God. There's a similar story where a guy called Job experiences in the Bible suffering and evil. I don't know who of you is very familiar with the Bible, but the story basically is quite simple. There's a guy, he's very righteous, he does everything right, and we have this feeling of, okay, if I do everything right, life will be good. But this guy, the Bible says, is the most perfect human being that ever lived in that time, and he has taken everything away. He gets sick, he loses his family, he loses his livelihood, he loses everything. And at the end of the day, his friends come to him and they give him all kinds of religious wisdom. They say, well, if we would have prayed more, or if we would have given more alms, or if we would have been more godly, or if there must be something wrong with you, just believe and keep going. And Job is crying out to God and saying, no, that's not fair, I don't agree with that, what's happening? And at the end he gets an answer, just like Habakkuk. But his answer, he's never get criticized by God, but his friends are criticized. Those who say, well, just keep believing, just keep going, those are criticized. Whereas Job was challenging God, was crying out to God, was saying to God, I don't agree with that. He is actually commanded by God and getting a great answer. So the reason why I'm telling you this is because the first point that I see in the Bible that is very, very critical, I think, is that the Bible invites us to be honest with our struggles. The Bible does not invite us to get theoretical answers and then try to think very hard or to fight very hard to really make believe that answer. But the Bible invites us, no. Like Luna was saying, God is just one prayer away. God invites us to pray to Him. God invites us to speak to Him and to be really honest with the people around us and with God about our struggles. Because what we will see while I'm walking through the biblical answer is that what God is saying is that I do understand your pain, and actually it's worse than you actually think, but the answer I can give to you is more glorious than you would ever imagine. So that's the first point I would love to make. The second point I would love to make is that we actually have a very strange way of thinking about our questions. So we have those ideas about God in our head where it's like, okay, God is all powerful and God is all loving and God is all good, and then we try to fix our ideas of God. But if you look at the Bible, obviously God is in the Bible, He's loving, the Bible says, and He's good, the Bible says, and He's powerful, but He's so much more. We've become very uncreative people, at least in my culture, and I think that's a very global problem where we've become very logical in our way of thinking, of approaching things, and we don't realize beauty in the world anymore. So when we look at the Bible, we are not thinking about a God who's sitting up in heaven and He's all powerful and all good and He's looking at the world and then He's trying to figure out stuff. But what we do see in the Bible is that God is also introduced to us as all creative, as all beautiful, as the great storyteller. So overall God is presented to us as a creative, full of imagination being, a creator who's full of imagination and full of creativity. And we see that in the first words of the Bible. So if you look at most who of you has ever picked up a philosophy book? None of you. Well, that's interesting, philosophy. You should read more philosophy. Anyways, most philosophy books are very logical. So they go through a structure, they present an argument, you have a premise, and another premise, and then you have a conclusion. But if you read read, I don't know who have you ever read the Quran. So, for example, the Quran is very logical in itself as well. It says, God likes this, God doesn't like that, so you better don't do the things God doesn't like, and you do the things God likes. It's quite easy. But the Bible invites us into a story. So the first words of the Bible are, in the beginning there was God. And then the story keeps going. And I find that fascinating because it starts like a story. If you watch an old Disney movie, it starts with long time ago there was, I don't know, Rapunzel and I don't know what. And so the Bible starts like a story. There was, at the beginning, at the very, very beginning of the whole story, there was a God. And this God, God creates this, and then God creates that, and God does this, and God does that. So it starts like a story, because it is a story. That doesn't mean it's not true, but it's still a story. It's presented to us in a way that invites our imagination. It's like if I would take the people from the first 2 rows and I would make a fire in the middle and we sit around the fire camp, and God is saying, you know what? Let me tell you the story how I made this world. Let me tell you the story that I live with human beings. So that's a very important fact that we often miss about God. So if we think then about the question, why am I so alone? Why am I suffering? Where is God if I need Him? We have to think about a God who's a storytelling God, actually. So that's very important because the whole Bible rests on that. The Bible is full of stories, full of beautiful stories that God tells, where He's working together with human beings to create something. And one of those stories I want to point out is the story of Joseph and his brothers. It's a very beautiful and simple story, and it speaks right to the question we have today. So, who of you knows the story of Joseph and his brothers? Okay. Almost everyone. Okay, that's fine. I still tell a story because I like to tell it. I have 40 minutes, so I've got to use my time. So basically, to sum up that story that goes through those chapters, there's this guy. He's called Joseph, and he comes from a very problematic family because his father, he has at least 4 wives. His father has at least 13 children with those 4 wives. So that's, I don't know who comes from a patchwork family of you, but that's quite a problematic situation. There's a lot of envy between the wives and between the children. And Joseph is the favorite child. So if you're a favorite child in a family full of envy, that means you are basically the target of everyone. And so Joseph ends up as the target of everyone. The story tells us that Joseph's brothers, because they hate him so much, they take him, they misuse him, and they throw him in a pit, and then they see a business opportunity coming up, and they're like, oh wow, we could sell him actually. Then they sell him, and he's off to Egypt and sold. But if you look at the story then from Joseph's eyes, it's actually quite heavy. I mean, think about it. This guy is now, without WhatsApp, Facebook and everything, in a foreign country, separated from his family. So there's no way of telling his father he's alive. There's no way of telling his mother he's alive. There's no way of reaching out to his brothers and saying, oh wow, would you want to think about that? That wasn't maybe such a wise choice. Look how I ended up. He's completely left alone as a slave in a foreign country where he doesn't speak the language, where he has no rights, and he's misused by his brothers and hurt, and everything is wrong. And I mean, I don't know what's your story, and I don't want to minimize your stories, because I think there are in this room stories of heartbreak as well, but that's a heartbreaking story to think about this man. I'm sure he cried out to God and said, God, where are you right now? Why are you not doing anything about it? And the story keeps on going, and it keeps on getting better actually. Joseph, since you all know the story, he gets promoted in Potiphar's house. It looks like, oh wow, it all works out fine. But then Potiphar's wife the wife of his boss, wants to sleep with him. He refuses. He gets accused of being a rapist, a sexual abuser, gets thrown into prison. So all of a sudden, this nice little, it all works out fine story looks quite crushing again. And Joseph is in prison now. It's even worse than being a slave. He has no rights. there's no perspective of him getting out of prison at all. He's separated still from his family, he's still in a foreign place, he has no home, he has nobody around that would ever comfort him. I mean, I'm sure if I would be in the situation, I would lose hope. I would cry out to God, where are you, God? Where are you right now? And I'm sure that's what Joseph did in that situation as well. But then there comes again a glimmer of hope. And two guys show up, and this one guy could actually help him get out of prison. And then the guy forgets about him. I mean, now the whole story of Joseph is full of, that doesn't look good at all. But then, as you all know, the story redeems itself. It turns around, he comes out of prison, and Joseph, because of all what happened to him, in the end of the day, he actually ends up being the second most powerful man in Egypt, in the most powerful nation in the world. And he is able to help his brother, rescue his brothers, his father, his whole larger family from a famine. And I love this story because at the end of his life, Joseph is able to look back on his life and he's able to say, but you intended for evil, God intended for good. He's able to look back at his life and say, well, if I now look, there are so many points in my life, in my story, that you guys actually tried to destroy me. You guys, it seems like life is going to just completely wreck me. But God redeemed all those places. God redeemed all those places where it seemed like a lost year. And at the end of the day, the only reason why he can sit in that position, the only reason why he can save his family, is because he went through all those things. God is writing a story with him, and he didn't even notice God is writing a story with him up until the very end. And that's sometimes what's happening in our lives. So I give you a little example again from my little son. So in late December, so just before Christmas, my son had a little surgical operation. So he's now he was 6 months at the time, and they said, well, if you go in with a camera through his penis, whatever, you don't have to know all the details, even though you're doctors. But they went in and they removed something which could actually help his bladder maybe to heal itself in 4 or 5 years, or at least stabilize the situation of his bladder and of his kidneys. So we went into the hospital with him. And because it's a surgical procedure, and because he had to sleep while the surgical procedure, he couldn't eat for 4 to 6 hours before the procedure. So he was, I don't know who of you has younger siblings and remembers when they were a baby. Is there anybody? There's a handful of you. So if a baby doesn't get to eat, they get very, very grumpy. They need to eat every hour, every other hour. So he could not eat for 4 to 6 hours. Me and my wife were with him. He was crying, he was shouting, he was like, what's wrong with you? Why are you refusing me to give me to eat? Why are you getting me hungry? And of course he can't say that, but he was crying. And we were talking to him, we were like, oh, don't cry, it's gonna be fine. You're gonna sleep soon and then you're gonna be fine. But he wouldn't understand what we were saying. It was like, why are they talking to me? I don't understand them. They're not helping me. I'm just hungry, I want to eat. I'm also grumpy because I can't sleep because I'm hungry. And so then finally the situation changes, the nurse comes in, and now I'm actually handing him over to a strange woman that he doesn't know. She takes a big needle and he pushes a needle into his arm. I mean, at that point when he looks at me, if he could speak, he would probably tell me, where are you, Dad? You're not a father to me, you're not helping me at all. You're leaving me alone with a strange woman. I'm hungry, I'm tired, and I'm hurt, and you're not here. But obviously, if in a couple of years, if he could look back, he would understand that what just happened to him was all for his good. It all led to something better for him, because God actually, not God, the doctors actually healed him in that situation. And I think that's one of the answers we could give from the Bible. I also don't want to overestimate that answer. So what I don't want you to go away with is to say, well, there's this guy who said, well, whatever happens to me, that's good. It's all for my good. That's not what the Bible is saying. So it says God can redeem those situations for my good. But there is things that are just evil and they are plain wrong. So the Bible doesn't just if you have seen something wrong in your life, if you have been violated, if you have been abused, if you have been mocked, whatever happened to you, God doesn't say, well, it's fine for you, just relax. No, God says that's wrong and that's evil. But the point I want to make is that at least what we see, because God is a story writer and because God is powerful, He actually writes a bigger story. So there is somebody who is authoring this life. There is somebody who is powerful enough leading this to a good end. This author invites us to be part of his story. And this author promises us that if we enter into his story, it will all turn out for our good, which is obviously a good news at some point. At some point it means that if you woke up today, whatever happened in your life, whatever circumstances you have in your life, whatever pain you have in your life, whatever past you have, God has not given up on you. It means that God works still a story for you. God is still inviting you. There's still a future ahead of you, and God is able to do amazing things with that. But obviously that leaves questions. So that's an unsatisfying answer if that's all I have to say on the topic. So the question that leaves is, who is that God? Can we know that God? Because if somebody's selling me a story, I want to know, who is this guy? Can I trust this guy with my story? And how do we really know that this God means it for our good, that this is a good God? How can we have certainty in that? And that's where I would like to point to a greater Joseph. So we have the story of Joseph in the Bible, but obviously the Bible, because the Bible is a story, every good story, if you go to a movie, has a centerpiece. Like, that's where the whole story leads up to. That's where it all is going to. And the point where the story of the Bible is going to is Jesus. He's the main character in the Bible. And this guy, I mean, we could argue wherever you're from, he's the most significant person in history. I mean, there's people who lived a couple of thousand years ago, but nobody remembers those people, or very few of them remember. There's nobody who has such a global impact, such a gigantic impact, but Jesus. I've talked about that on Monday for those who are here. And the claim of the story in the Bible is that this random man from Galilee actually is God himself. So there is, in the biblical narrative, to just summarize it very quickly, there is one God who created everything. And this one God is not distant, but he became a man to redeem this world. And this man is basically Joseph is shadowing the story of Jesus. So we see with Joseph the abuse, the being in a foreign land, the difficulties, the constant struggle that happens in Joseph's life. And we then see how God redeems Joseph's story. We see something similar with Jesus. With Jesus we see somebody who was persecuted, who had to flee at some point in his life, and who was a refugee at some point in his life, and lived in a foreign land, who was abused, who was betrayed, who was publicly humiliated, who was spit at. So if you are God and you are able to choose to once for all come into this world, that's the destiny God chose for him. He chose for him to come as a guy somewhere in the middle of nowhere place in Galilee, to be persecuted, to flee, to be a refugee, to be mistreated, to be publicly humiliated, to be betrayed, to be spit at. And this God, this one God who revealed himself in Jesus Christ, in his most lonely moment, where everybody has left him, hanging on a cross, betrayed by all his friends, feeling the whole pain, the whole consequence of the evil of this world in himself. Like, there's nothing that's wrong in this world that Jesus would not carry at that moment. And he's crying out with the pain and says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's completely stricken. And that's significant, because if it's true that Jesus is God, that means we have a God who knows whatever we suffer, that's not a distant thing. Whatever happens to us, he's not saying, well, I have no clue how it feels like, but don't worry, it's going to be fine. But we have a God who actually knows how it feels like. There's a very powerful story that I really, really love. It's called by a man called Elie Wiesel. He was a Holocaust survivor. So Elie Wiesel was Jewish, and the Nazis in the Second World War, they put him into Auschwitz, which was basically a death camp, the most horrible camp. And he tells in one of his books a story where he says the Nazi guards, they took all the prisoners in that death camp, and they made them stand and watch how they killed 3 men. They were hanging 3 men on a tree, and 2 of those men died quickly, but the 3rd man, he didn't die quickly. He was hanging there on a tree, crying out like, I have so much pain, please help me. And those people were forced to stand there, watch this suffering, this evil, this heinous crime for hours. And Elie Wiesel remembers in that book thinking to himself, where is God? Where is God in such an evil moment? And then he realizes God is right here. God is suffering with this man. He's hanging next to this man and feeling the pain of this man. And that's a deeply Christian answer. The answer of the cross, the answer God is giving us at the cross, what the cross means is that God not only cares about our feelings in moments of suffering and invites us to be honest with him. Not only is God saying, well, I'm the author of the story and I invite you to be part of the story, but actually God himself knows our pain, he feels our pain, he has been through our pain, and is with us in our pain. So the Bible calls Jesus God with us, because through Jesus we know this God is going through every distance imaginable to be with us, to carry our pain, and to lead us through the darkest moments of life. So whenever you ask yourself, where is God? Where is God when I need him? Where is God in all the injustice? Where is God when I've been mistreated? The answer is, he's at one particular point. He's with you. It's actually 2 particular points. He's with you, but you know he's with you because he showed and proved it in history on the cross. And so what I said at some point earlier on is that what God is saying to us is that I know the pain, I know the suffering, it's actually worse than you can imagine, but my answer is more glorious than you can imagine. And that's what we see when we keep on reading in the story of the cross. So for those of you who haven't read further than Jesus died on the cross, spoiler alert, Jesus rises from the dead. So the reason why Jesus knows it's worse than we think, or why God can say it's worse than we think, is because he knows more than we know. So we see suffering, but we only see our own suffering, or maybe somebody we can visibly see, but we don't see all the hurt somebody's feeling because of things we don't see. Sometimes a harsh word, sometimes a careless word can have significant impacts on other people, and we don't even realize it. And God sees all of that. And God does not only see the injustice done to us, but he also sees the justice done by us. So Every one of us has been in a moment where he said, where is God when I need him? But every one of us has been the reason why somebody had to say, where is God when I need him? Every one of us has been the one who has done wrong to somebody else at some point in his life. Every one of us would have been the answer when somebody cried out, where is God when I need him? We would have been able to help somebody, and we didn't do it. And that's what Jesus is also paying for. He is paying for all the moments where we failed to do justice. So when Jesus died on the cross, he felt the pain of the suffering of this world and of the injustice of this world. And when Jesus died on the cross, he paid the price for the suffering in this world that each one of us caused. But then, as I said before, Jesus rose from the dead. Jesus defeated death. Because he defeated death, he can offer now not only a clean slate for every one of us, but he can offer actually us to join in a new humanity. So it says in the Bible, he is the first from many, many brothers. What this means, and it's complicated theology, and I don't want to go too deep, but what it basically means is that every one of us has a second chance in this life, in this world, to restart, to be led by Jesus, and to live a life that actually follows in Jesus' footsteps. That's what the Bible means with taking up your cross. So that's one of the most common calls we hear Jesus say. He's saying, pick up your cross, follow me. That means walk in my footsteps, do what I did, challenge injustice in this world, challenge pain and suffering in this world, do something to be an answer to other people. And he challenges us to change our position from being those who are part of this web of injustice, because it's a web, it's very tricky, we're all part of it somehow, and it challenges us to become part of the solution. When Jesus taught his disciples to pray, he taught them to pray, your kingdom comes on earth as it is in heaven. And that's what Jesus invites us to do. That's what Jesus did ultimately. When we follow Jesus' footsteps, we are bringing a kingdom on earth that will, at the end, that's what the great promise at the end is. This kingdom will make happen that there will be no more tears, no more pain, no more sorrow, no more suffering. That's the promise that Jesus gives to his followers. When Jesus' kingdom is fully revealed. So I've spoken a lot, and I just want to summarize what I said to just make sense of the biblical answer the way I see it. The Bible, or the story of the Bible, invites us to be honest with our suffering, because God knows our suffering, and he is a relational God. He's one God that wants to hear us, who wants to relate to us, who wants to reveal himself to us. The biblical answer is also that God is all creative and full of imagination, the author of the story of this world, and he invites us to step into his story. And the reason why we can trust his story is because Jesus reveals God fully to us, because God became human in Jesus, and because Jesus proved that this story will end well, because Jesus himself defeated death, and he promised all who follow him that he will defeat death for them, that he will offer them a life that will see no more pain, no more sorrow, no more suffering. And he invites us to walk in his footsteps and challenge the injustice and the suffering of this world. And that's the invitation Jesus gives to all of us. Thank you very much for listening.